Hello everyone, and welcome to our British Council panel on rethinking assessment in plurilingual and bilingual education. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Levy and I'm head of our English programs team in Spain, and I'm speaking to you today from my home in the village of Alpedete. I'm about 40 kilometers outside Madrid, and this afternoon it's horribly wet and miserable here. I know we have people who've joined us from all over Spain and all over the world, so I hope it's a nicer day wherever you are. I just wanted to give you a little background on today's panel and set it in the context of the work that we're doing here in Spain. So as many of you know, we're celebrating 80 years of the British Council School and the British Council in Spain, and also 25 years of our bilingual education programme in collaboration with the Spanish Ministry of Education and the 10 regional governments. We wanted to celebrate all of this with a big face-to-face international conference at our British Council School in February 2021. But unfortunately, as with so many other things, COVID has determined otherwise, and we've moved everything online. In doing so, though, we thought it'd be useful to start building towards the conference by focusing on three crucial elements, three crucial themes for plurilingual education programs, focusing on assessment, on inclusion, and on quality assurance. But we also wanted to open up the conversations and not just present what is already happening. So we came up with the idea of discussion panels to allow us to look at what we're doing and also at what we could do to allow us to rethink assessment, to rethink inclusion, and to rethink quality assurance to ensure the best learning outcomes for our students. So that's what we're doing. And we start today with rethinking assessment for plurilingual education. In a moment, I'm going to pass you on to the chair of today's panel, to my colleague, Vicky Clark from our Global Assessment Solutions team. But quickly before that, just a little bit of housekeeping. If it hasn't already opened, you should see a button for the Q&A, the questions and answers, on your screen. In my screen, it's in the middle. In yours, it might be top right, I think, for some people. Open that, please, the question and answers, so that you can post questions to us at any time during the event for the panel. We have two moderators, Erica and Maureen, and they'll be looking at the Q&A throughout the conversation, throughout the discussion, and they'll be passing on questions to Vicky later to pass on to the panelists. So please do that. And you might also find that, not Vicky, but Erica and Maureen are also adding their own comments and adding links to the Q&A to tie you into things that our panelists are saying. So it is worth keeping it open. So I think that's it from me for now. I'll speak to you again at the end, but for now I'd like to pass you on to Vicky Clark, who's the chair of this panel, to get the conversation going. Over to you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you all for joining us for today's conversation about assessment in plurilingual education. I'm going to be your chair for today, and I'll be with you throughout the session, just to let you know that sometimes you'll hear me, but you may not always see me. We have three panelists today. You can see their full bios on our website, but I'd just like to briefly introduce them. First, we have Lucy Crayon. Now, Lucy has worked in schools in 5 top performing education systems around the world and has written a book about education superpowers. The book is entitled Cleverlands: The Secrets Behind the Success of the World's Education Superpowers. Next, we have Barry O'Sullivan, who is the Head of Assessment Research and Development at the British Council. In addition to being a world leading expert in language assessment, Barry is also the founding president of the UK Association of Language Testing and Assessment, UCALTA, and was recently awarded an OBE for his work in language assessment. And finally, we have Ana Linares, who is professor in the English department at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Apologies for my Spanish, I'm a pre-A1, apologies. And she has published widely on content and language integrated learning, mainly applying systematic functional linguistic models. So a warm welcome to all our panelists. Today's session will be in 2 parts. In the first part, each of the panelists will present for a few minutes on an aspect related to the theme. Then the next part will be a Q&A session. First, we'll have questions that have already been submitted by participants, and after that part, we will look at questions that panelists can submit during this session today. So please remember to use the Q&A function, and my colleagues who will be moderating, Erica and Maureen, will pass those questions on to me. So let's start. Can I now ask Lucy to give her presentation about assessment in top performing education systems? Thank you. So Lucy, mute.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Delighted to be here. And yes, I will be addressing a rather big question about how do they do assessment in some of the world's top performing education systems. So to begin with, assessment looks like something which they have the least in common. So you'll all have heard, no doubt, of the famous Finland. Everyone likes to talk about Finland and how in Finland they don't have any national external assessment. That's completely true. Until students are 18, there is no universal national assessment. And even at 18, many students don't take that if they don't want to go to university. On the other extreme, you have Singapore. So in Singapore, students take national assessments at the age of 12, and then again at age 16 and 18. And because they're quite high stakes exams, they determine which secondary schools students are able to go to, and even what assessment students are subsequently able to take. So if you don't do well in this test at age 12, you're not able to take your O-levels, for example. And this leads to some rather negative effects, as you can imagine. Quite a lot of pressure on students to do well in these exams, and quite a lot of money invested in private tutoring, which isn't great from an equity perspective, as you can imagine. Coming somewhere in the middle is Canada. So Canadian education is actually run by the provincial level, but they have many things in common, and one of these being assessment. And the standard practice in Canada seems to be that students might have a provincial level external assessment in one or two subjects in a few years. So for example, they might have a provincial English assessment in grade 10 and then a maths in grade 11, where other subjects are based on teacher given grades. So what I mean by teacher given grades, because this happens in both Finland and in Canada, is that teachers will base their assessment, their summative, I suppose, grade, which they give to parents that they write on school records, based on the student's work in that year. So having laid out how different they are in terms of that external summative assessment, that hides something more important, I think, which is the commonalities that they have when it comes to formative assessments. So although in Finland they don't have external tests, they do have a lot of tests. So if you spend time in Finnish schools, you will see that students are regularly set tests by their teachers, but these are tests designed by the teachers in order for the teachers to understand where the students are in that subject, identify misconceptions, etc. The same is true across East Asian countries, Japan, Shanghai, Singapore. The results of these teacher-given tests are used formatively. So as you'll know, well, you know what formative means, but teachers will use those assessments and those homeworks to identify what students haven't yet understood. And crucially, and this is the bit that sometimes I think we miss in England, where I'm from, the teachers then do something about it. It's not just about identifying misconceptions, it's then about changing your next lesson to make sure that you have addressed those before you move on. So just an example of how that's done across East Asian countries and also Finland is that often you'll see at the beginning of a lesson, the first thing in a lesson will be the teacher going through the homework or the work from the last lesson, getting students to come up to the front and explain what they did if they've done it particularly well, but making sure that before they move on to that next topic, they have identified any things that the students got wrong and given them some whole class feedback. So not only is that helpful, obviously, in terms of the students taking that feedback on board, it also saves on teacher workload because that feedback is addressed to the whole class. It's not written at length on individual student pieces of work. I'll leave it there, Vicky, because I know lots of it in this session.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your presentation. I'd like now to move to Barry, and Barry will present on validity in assessment, a plurilingual perspective. Thank you, Barry.
Hi, I suppose I should first talk a little bit about what I mean by validity. For me, validity is all about being able to make inferences based on a test performance that are supported by evidence. Okay, that's a very technical definition, but we'll come back to it, I hope, by the time my 4 minutes are up, or 4.5 minutes. My view of validity is that it should be person-centric. By this I mean the test taker should lie at the heart of the test development and validation process. This means we should have as full an understanding of the characteristics of the test-taking population as possible before starting out on the journey of test development. I believe we can't start without that. As developers of language tests, we should also have in place 4 things. Number 1, we should have a clear model of language and an understanding of how individuals tend to progress in terms of their learning of language. We also need a well-defined model of test development so that we can systematically build the test and its support system. Now that's fairly uncontroversial, but the next 2 probably are a bit more controversial. One is that we need an awareness of the needs and expectations of the key stakeholders who will be affected by the test. So we need to know who is defining our test use context, in other words, who are the people. And we then need a communication plan to allow for the resolving of issues around the test to the satisfaction of all concerned. Up to now, validity and validation has been quite a highbrow issue where academics tend to talk to academics or policymakers or lawyers and nobody else. People like teachers, parents, test takers are ignored. Now, in homogeneous populations, the process of development is relatively straightforward, as test takers are likely to share a common language and culture. However, it's been my experience, and no doubt yours, that no context is fully homogeneous. Instead, they tend to be multilingual and multicultural. So while individual test takers may be plurilingual, the diversity of languages and cultures suggests that the typical approach to test development is seriously problematic. This is because test takers are generally ignored by test developers. Sometimes there's a vague recognition of the level of the person, the age of the person, or even the gender in task design, but that does not always happen, believe me. The assumption of most national and international tests tends to be that all test takers are the same. In other words, these tests are test taker agnostic. Now, there's no such thing. Obviously, there cannot be any such thing. The existence of a mixture of monolingual and plurilingual test takers, often with a range of different linguistic backgrounds, means that not all tests can be demonstrated to work consistently across such a diverse population. Therefore, they're not valid. It ain't rocket science. The solution. The issue is that there isn't a solution, or if there is, it's not a simple solution. And it doesn't rest with assessment. It must rest right across the whole learning system. It starts with the curriculum on into the delivery of that curriculum through teacher selection, teacher training, teacher monitoring, textbooks, physical or online delivery systems. And finally, it should be the assessment as well, which should also reflect this through some level of localization or personalization. And that's the issue. How do we deal with a plurilingual context when there isn't one plurilingual context? Because my other languages may not be your other languages. We may not have the other languages in common. So having a single standardized approach to the assessment simply doesn't work. And I don't believe it can work. The only possibilities that I see going forward for large scale tests are technology driven, where we move into the area of personalization, but that brings with it its own issues. And I leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. And can I now move on to Anna? And Anna will be talking about assessing language or content. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much. A pleasure to be here sharing this fascinating topic of assessment. I'm going to look at the big issue of integrating content and language in assessment in bilingual education. And this is particularly, a key issue and a challenging issue for content teachers particularly, but also for language teachers, okay, who see in bilingual schools that the way they have focused assessment in the English subject, for example, has changed due to the doing other subjects through English, and they're learning English, therefore, in other subjects. So the issue here is not to what extent language assessment is important in content and language integrated learning or bilingual education. The issue here is how can we help teachers assess language without, of course, separating that from the content that they are, of course, teaching. And in our research group for some years, we've been exploring different ways of approaching assessment, content and language integrated assessment in bilingual education. And we've come across three types of assessment that I would like to share with you today. One is the use of integrated rubrics, right? The use of scales, which has scales and rubrics are very difficult, but they have the advantage that students know what they are expected to achieve, right? It gives credit to what they can do because, they can do as much as they can, and it values even if they can, less than others, right? And it moves from simpler to more complex, both in terms of content, and it can also be done in a parallel way with language, okay? With language that is related to that specific content. To give you an example, in history, in the topic of humanism, the students can be expected to, at a more simple level, let's say, to define or report on the development of humanism, but other students could, for example, argue whether Lutheranism had been or not possible without the existence of humanism, right? So it gives this opportunity for students to go further or not so far, both in terms of content and in terms of way. Right, the second assessment technique that we have been sharing with teachers in seminars is the use of holistic assessment in pairs, the use of comparative judgment. There are different tools that are out there that can be used to do that, so it's like very different. It's almost the opposite from what I've just been explaining, right? Rather than using rubrics, what you have is you get teachers to compare right, and holistically decide which of the two is better, and then continuously doing that with different pairs of text that appear on the screen. And we found that extremely useful for awareness raising in groups of content and language teachers who work together in the same school, right? They are expected to collaborate together, but they don't really know what language means for, English teachers or language teachers do not really content teachers, and content teachers, of course, history teachers or physics teachers or biology teachers, they may have these different ideas of what language means for them. So with these comparative judgment techniques, what you get is that you can raise awareness so that teachers can engage in discussions and decide, why a text is better assessed by a language teacher and not so, well assessed by a content teacher. So that's the second type of assessment that we've been discussing. And the third one is related to Lucy's presentation, but it has to do with assessment for learning, and especially assessment for learning, trying to sort of investigate the possibilities of discourse, right? The type of discourse that is carried out by teachers with their students that can enhance, it can have a triple effect, let's say, enhance content learning, enhance thinking, higher order thinking skills, and enhance language learning. Because of course, if you get students to reflect upon their learning in a certain session, they have to, of course, go back to the content that they've learned, but they also have to think further and metalinguistically also, reflect on what they've learned. And for that, they need language, and they need quite sophisticated language, right? So I wanted to sort of share with you these three types of techniques that could help integrating content and language. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And what I'd like to do is I'd just like to very quickly summarise, if I can, some of the main points that have been made by our presenters before we go on to the question section. First of all, Lucy mentioned some of the vast differences between the summative assessment techniques used by the superpowers, these education superpowers, but then also focused on the commonality of a very strong, rigorous formative assessment agenda within the schools. And that obviously led to the success, as we know, within the learning. Then Barry moved on to validity within language assessment and made two main points. One being that the test taker should be at the heart, or a couple of main points, sorry, test taker should be at the heart of language test development and validation. The importance of involving a whole variety of stakeholders within our language test development conversations. And finally, the importance of understanding that there is no homogeneous context in either a monolingual, plurilingual environment. Test takers have different backgrounds, different language needs, etc., etc. And I think advocated perhaps for the future to include some form of technology-driven assessment where personalisation or localisation can occur, albeit with the difficulties that may bring. And then finally, Anna looked at not whether language is important to be assessed through content, but how, and gave us three techniques, one being the rubrics that could be used, obviously to improve student motivation and understanding, but also for us to be able to understand the from simple to complex, the objectives being hoping to be achieved. We looked at the concept of holistic assessment and awareness raising through comparative judgments from both content and language teachers. And finally, the idea of reflection, this metalinguistic metacognition necessary by the student themselves. So I think there, hopefully I've faithfully summarised your main points, and I'd like to now go on to the second part of this conversation. I'm going to start with asking questions to each of our panelists that have already been sent in earlier by participants. So I'm going to start with Barry. Barry, I'd like you to answer the following question. The question is, how can we ensure a fair and valid assessment approach given the diversity of bilingual implementation in Spain? And that question is to Barry O'Sullivan.
A nice, easy question to start with. Thank you very much. The issue that we have is where the input and where the individuals are similar in terms of background and language, there's a commonality. The issue then becomes where there's not a similarity, we have a problem. And as Anna pointed out just in her response, that I think actually Anna's presentation could have probably answered a lot of the question. It reminds me a lot of the discussions we had going back 20 years ago on the ESP debate and the balancing of the content and the language and drawing a line between one and the other. And it's always going to be an issue. It's not an issue that is very easily solved, and it's an issue that can probably only be solved by taking multiple perspectives. And that suggests that the single high stakes test that's standardized across the country on its own won't give us the information we want. It may give us some information, but unless there's some localized and personalized information or data about those individual test takers, then we're never going to get a true understanding of where they are. So I was very interested in what Anna had to say because I felt that the multiple approaches is the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. The next question will be for Lucy. So Lucy, the question that has been sent in is about teacher quality. It claims that clearly teacher quality is important. How do we get teachers to be above average?
Thank you, Vicky. Just pausing there to make sure I was actually unmuted. So obviously, two of the main ways are with initial teacher selection and training, but I'm going to put those to one side because that's the obvious answer. Two things I want to draw out from top performing systems and how they ensure high teacher quality and continually improving teacher quality within a school. One is regular co-planning. So as a regular practice, so this happens in Finland, Japan, Singapore, Shanghai, in your weekly timetable as a teacher, there will be one session at least where you are free with other teachers of the same subject or of the same year group, and you will plan the next week's lessons together. And that includes planning how you're going to assess whether or not students have understood. So what that means is that every week you've got less experienced teachers seeing how more experienced teachers are designing their lessons and that assessment. The second thing I'd like to draw out is the importance of the school environment, and research has recently found that a supportive school environment leads to disproportionately greater improvement in teacher effectiveness over time than a less supportive environment. And what I mean by that specifically is that it's an environment in which lesson observations are not about judging a teacher or judging their lesson, but about learning from that teacher or providing supportive feedback to that teacher. So often teachers will, in a lesson study approach, for example, they will watch another teacher teaching a lesson which they have jointly planned. In that way, they're not judging the teacher. They know what the teacher's going to do. They're judging the plan that they have jointly planned. And what they're doing is, crucially, is they're watching the students and they're seeing how are the students responding to this particular kind of teaching input. And therefore, they're continually improving their understanding of how learners learn and therefore the effectiveness of their teaching.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. And now on to Anna. I have a question for you. The question is, Anna, how can teachers foster students' ability to reflect on their own plurilingual competence in non-language specific subjects?
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Yes, well, I mean, teacher is a language teacher, right? And it is key for teachers, not only when they're teaching in a second language, such as English, but also when they're teaching in their first language, that language is the center, or what, well, as well the center of a teaching activity. And definitely students should be encouraged to reflect on their plural competence and the opportunities that they have for using not only one language, but the different languages that they have in the repertoire to be able to address, understand, and express the content that they're learning. And there is an interesting project that has been carried out in Australia for a long time, which is called the Reading to Learn project, that has to do with enhancing literacy skills language learners, particularly with children at school. And the idea is to get the students to deconstruct texts in different disciplines, okay, and then in that way focus very narrowly on the actual language resources that are necessary to express different types of meanings, to express different types of genres, right, and deconstruct these texts together, the students with the teacher, and then to co-construct those texts together. In that way, they're aware of the linguistic resources that they need to express different meanings, different functions, and different genres. And that way, making language very much salient, but not separate from the content that is being taught, I think is key in any subject that is taught, both in the first language or second language, third language, in any language. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Now we have some more questions, and this one will be directed to Barry. So Barry, the question is it fair and valid for primary and secondary school pupils who are learning subjects through English to sit standardized English language tests to assess their English ability? I think you touched upon this in your presentation, but can you continue that conversation a little bit more and explain in more detail what might be the problems with that, using a standard ELT test to assess the English language capacity of students learning their subjects through English. Barry, I think you're on mute.
I was, of course I was. It has to catch everybody. It's a special trap. One of the issues that I see with using a regular, we'll call it standardized international test for this purpose is the test was designed to give what the designers claim is a general view of a person's language ability. Whereas within the context of their learning, it's a mixed context of language and subject matter, we'll call it. So the levels of ability and the levels of proficiency may be different. There may be strong similarities, of course, but there's a likelihood that there will be differences. So we'll be teaching and expecting a use of language in one context and testing a use of language in a different context. So it's very difficult to accept that those are always going to fit into line. They may, we're not saying it's impossible, but it's fairly unlikely, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry.
Actually, I noticed Anna nodding away sagely there, and Mark as well. I wonder what you think, because I talk about it from a native speaker of English perspective who hasn't actually taught language for 30 years maybe. So tell me what you think. You're on the button. Anna first, maybe.
I'm mute. Okay. Yes, I mean, I agree. I mean, the question is a little bit tricky because is it reasonable? Okay, I have it here. Subjects through English to sit an ELT test to assess their learning. What is their learning? I mean, an ELT test would assess language. I mean, in any case, even if we think of, okay, we need a test to assess their everyday English compared to their academic English, fair enough. But I still think ELT tests should be the same as content subject should have more language, but integrated, of course, with the content. I think English tests and English subjects should incorporate more content, and it makes no sense to make a division, right? So they're doing English in the English class more and more. They need to bring aspects related to literacy and more content, let's say, because of course, students come with a higher level of English in general in bilingual schools and so on. And in content, of course, it's in more language awareness. So I don't think, I think there is now a new scenario for, changing the way ELT tests are designed and implemented, to be honest. It's challenging, but I think it opens a new fascinating, time to explore new ways of testing English. But what is English, or what is, a second language or foreign language? Sorry, maybe I've gone a bit too expanded a bit too much, but thanks.
Is anyone else who would like to answer that question, or can I ask a related one? Changing it slightly and keeping with Anna, if you don't mind, just briefly. Is it fair then and valid for primary and secondary school pupils who are learning subjects through English to sit exams in Spanish to assess their content learning? If we just change that, put it on its head.
Well, I know this is a controversial issue, and to be honest, my answer would be it depends on the type of exam, because we've seen some studies that were carried out at the beginning of the Comunidad de Madrid bilingual program, for example, showing that students that took this final external exam in general competences, right, at the end of primary education, those students who did who studied in bilingual schools performed less well, successfully in science, social science. The explanation was arguably that because they had studied those subjects, those disciplines in English, and the test was done in Spanish. But to be honest, if a test, I mean, research has already shown that there is transfer of strategies from one language to the other. And we've seen in our own research how students who are able to define well in one language, no matter which one they have studied that topic in, they are able to define similarly, canonically or non-canonically in the other language, right? But if the test is based on vocabulary, obviously, if these students have learned biology in English, they won't have probably all the vocabulary that they need to respond to, to do well in a test in Spanish. And unfortunately, students are not given the opportunity of showing this more meta, let's say, linguistic awareness that bilingual students develop in tests, because the tests do not expect them to do that. They do not push them to do that. They're quite factual, in my view. So depends on the type of test, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And I'm seeing in the, Barry, I think Barry wants to make a comment. Can we go back to Barry?
There is some other evidence that over time, the kids in those situations actually make up on their content knowledge, even when measured in a different language. So it's a very complicated situation. I would find it very, very difficult to accept that you could teach a subject in one language and then test the subject in a different language. Look, we know, for example, from studies done in South Africa that in the PISA exams, students whose home language is not the language of assessment perform up to 25% lower on the scales. And it's highly likely that that is down to a language issue, not a study, not a knowledge issue. It's up there.
Okay, thank you very much. What we've noticed in the chat, in the Q&A section, is there's been a lot of conversation around teachers and teachers' language assessment, literacy, teacher quality. So I'm going to read a question which I'm going to direct at Lucy. I'll start off with a general one, Lucy, and that is, what role do resources play in ensuring effective assessment in top performing countries? If we can start with that, and I shall move on to teachers after.
So to break it down again very briefly initially, high quality textbooks are an invaluable resource, and it's easy to say, harder to do, I know, but in countries such as Finland, they are used an awful lot. Again, perhaps contrary to some people's stereotypes about what they do in Finland. But those textbooks are designed for, in teachers' words, real depth of understanding and engagement for students. They're designed by teachers for students, and they're tested on students. And crucially, then what they don't try and do, which English textbooks in England do, is try and prepare students for external assessments and have that as their main focus. I think that's a key difference. But perhaps a more useful answer for people who can't just snap their fingers and develop some high quality textbooks is teacher guides. So teacher guides, so in Singapore these are used a lot, and actually sometimes developed by teachers within a school or across a group of schools, where teachers pool their experience and their knowledge about specifically assessment questions. So both formatively, so, you know, what questions can we ask within particular topics, particular subjects? You know, what questions can we ask when we're teaching gravity to identify what students have which misconceptions, rather than a teacher having to come up with those on the spur of the moment or by themselves. That knowledge and experience is pooled in a teacher's guide. Similarly, summative questions as well. So rather than teachers having to just come up with them themselves, which would require quite a lot of expertise and assessment to do well, they have this open on their desk to use as they see fit or as they need to during lesson.
Oops. Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm going to keep with teachers here. There's been a couple of questions around teacher professionalisation, language assessment, literacy. I'll read one out if I may, and I'll keep with Lucy, and then I'll ask Anna and Barry after to also comment. So Lucy, if I can read this question to you. In the chat it was posted that Lucy mentioned the commonalities in approaches to formative assessment in these powerhouses, and the participant wonders if there is another commonality related to the professionalism and autonomy of teachers. The participant mentions that in Finland, for example, a master's degree is standard, and they have a great deal of autonomy in both setting, marking and deciding responses to assessment. Is professionalism and trust in teachers the key? I'll start with Lucy and then I'll go on to other panelists.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and really important that you picked up on both of those things, because trust by itself is not enough. If you put trust in teachers but they don't have the masters in teaching, that can go one of two ways. It can be brilliant if they're a great teacher, or it can completely flop. So yes, the key is the combination of those two things, and certainly in top performing systems that it's professionalized in the sense that there are clear entry requirements to the profession. Usually there is standardization of initial teacher education as well. You know, what do teachers need to know and be able to do in order to enter the profession in the first place. And then in some of the countries, particularly in East Asia, it's additionally there's a professional, I suppose I'm comparing it to medicine in particular, I suppose, but there's a professionalism in the sense that they have career structures where it's not simply that you are a teacher and then you're left alone to get on with it for your whole career, but rather there's continual expectation that you will improve and that you will get better throughout your career and become, for example, a lead teacher, a master teacher, and part of your role then becomes supporting less experienced teachers to become as good as you are. So there's an expectation there's a commonality in terms of what is understood to be a good teacher, which sometimes I think in the West is the challenge, that we disagree on what that means. But yes, absolutely, professionalism. And then once you've got that, you know, once you've got those, I suppose, checks, essentially, let's call it what they are, checks and balances, to make sure that people do know what they're supposed to know and do have the skills that they're required to be excellent, then yes, they can get on with it as they see fit. But you've got to have both. You can't have one without the other.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm going to ask Anna to respond to the same question. So let me just quickly read that back out to you. It's about the concept of professionalisation and autonomy of teachers, but also can I also add possibly the element of what sort of training might be necessary as well, if you can think on that as well. So Anna, could you respond to that? And then I'll ask Barry to give a final response to that question.
Yes, definitely. I totally agree with everything that Lucy has just said. I mean, professionalism is key. We have, I mean, in Spain, as you know, bilingual education programs are big, very big, and there is a lot of interest, a lot of work done by teachers. They are interested in participating in training programs, but there are very few universities, for example, offering masters that are specifically addressed specifically for secondary school teachers. There are a few for primary school teachers, but very few that address specifically the issue of literacies, the role of language in teaching. And I think it's key. It's key because I can see once you get to teachers, right, when you happen to meet teachers and you collaborate with them in our research project, for example, then you can see how interested they are. They see it, but there is very little. I mean, we need masters, professional masters, and we need yeah, definitely, yes.
Okay, fantastic. And Barry, could you please also respond, perhaps the angle of language assessment literacy in terms of teacher?
Well, I've always felt and argued that there's been too great a disconnect between assessment and the rest of the learning system, particularly the formal assessment side, which has been traditionally left in the hands of experts or so-called experts. I'm not particularly convinced that people who claim to be experts in language assessment can genuinely argue that they are, because for me, to make a valid and appropriate assessment, you need expertise not just in test development and in language. You need expertise in the context. You need to know the people you're dealing with, and you need to know about the needs and expectations of those people and the other key stakeholders. For me, language assessment literacy should be a critical part of the teacher training process or teacher education process. I'm not saying that it's the only part, but it's one part. And I always talk about my triangle with my curriculum, the delivery of that curriculum and the assessment. They all have to be connected. If they're not connected, the system doesn't work, it falls apart. In the same way as language assessment literacy, we feel is needed, it must be part of a system. It can't drive a system. But teachers need to know. They need to know about assessment. They need to know what they know, and they need to know what they don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to keep with Barry, but I'm going to shift the conversation onto something I think very relevant to the Spanish context. I'll read the question out. It's the question is, could the inclusion of mediation and plurilingual skills in international language exams result in a more positive washback of an exam itself, and how would that even be feasible? So Barry, just a nice easy question for you to start.
The first part is dead simple. Yes. It would definitely result in more positive washback. How it could happen is anybody's guess. It may well be that it's not possible. As I said in my own presentation, once you start getting into fully understanding who these students are, and you think about them particularly from the plurilingualist perspective, as a plurilingual, your plurilingualism may not be the same as Anna's and may not be the same as Lucy's or Mark's. So people may have different backgrounds, so that there's no commonality. So without that commonality, it's very difficult. Mediation, on the other hand, I think it is possible to introduce mediation, particularly in the way that mediation has been defined in the CEFR companion volume. And when we think of mediation of concepts as well as mediation of texts, I think already some tests can claim to have at least some level of mediation in there. But it is certainly a way forward, and it is something that we should be looking at from both perspectives, mediation of concepts and mediation of texts.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. Can I move to Anna? Anna, could you respond also to the question? I'll repeat it. Could the inclusion of mediation and plurilingual skills in international language tests, exams, result in a more positive washback of the exam itself? And would that be feasible? Or how would that be feasible?
Yes, well, yes, I agree with Barry. Yes, the answer, would that be feasible? Again, you know, it's a question of working more, you know, from the pre-service teacher training programs on how to, you know, to train teachers in assessment. And I completely agree with Barry's point of relating the curriculum with the actual assessment practice. I mean, with the type of assessment. I mean, one of the problems is this awareness of that we assess what we teach and what we are expected to teach, and also that our students know what they're going to be assessed on and how they're going to be assessed on. Right? I definitely, and I can see it also from a teacher training program where, you know, that we offer in my university. Assessment takes a very small part in the program, and I think it's because everybody's you know, it's because it's an issue that is very difficult to cover so yes, definitely we need to work more on that, but I don't have the answer of how. But probably this you know, opportunity of you know, more dialogue between content teachers and language teachers, and see language as a kind of cross-curricular tool may help at least in conversation to sort of get to agreements in what to assess and how to assess. But big question, yes, I agree.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it, even just for that, while Anna was speaking, when you think about it, one of the issues we have is that in the current version of the CFR, the CV, both mediation and plurilingualism are delivered in scales. And I just don't feel that those scales can work in the real world. We all know, of students who are very, very proficient plurilingual communicators, but their level of English is pretty diabolical. I spent a couple of years, many years ago, working in Peru, where I made the mistake of telling my students that they could talk as long as they spoke English, they could talk about it as long as they liked and as much as they liked. And the little fellas never shut up because they had carte blanche and off they went. Their English wasn't very good, but by God, did they want to communicate. I've never forgotten that. And when I see scales now for mediation and plurilingualism, I always worry because these were 11 and 12-year-olds who were extremely proficient plurilingualists, if there's such a word.
Thank you very much, Barry. Now I'm going to ask and start with Lucy, because we've got very little time left, for a 30-second response, each of you, starting with Lucy, on the following question that has just been sent in. How do you find the balance between the assessment of the content and the language when curricula are so restrictive about what needs to be assessed in content subjects, for example, in science, in bilingual programs? So how does one find a balance between the assessment of the content and of language when with curricular restrictions that exist as they are? And then after Lucy, I'll go to Anna. So just 30 seconds each, everyone. We have very little time. You're on mute, Lucy, sorry.
You've lost some of your time.
I'm going to generously hand over my time to Anna and Barry because I can see they have much more to say on this subject than I do. Anna had her hand up.
Move over to Anna to start then.
Yes. Well, the question is not really so much about balancing. The question is about integrating. Of course, if you think of, content teachers are expected to address language issues on top of what they have, but the question is not seeing language as something separate from content. The question is, what is the language that is relevant for my content? Do I integrate language awareness in relation to the content issues that I'm teaching and the type of text that I'm expecting my students to read, and so on and so forth, and highlight and make language more salient, but not as separate? No, it's not a question of balancing. It's more how to make sure that language issues that may be relevant for that particular content are salient. So this is.
Thank you, Anna. And can we move now to Barry for the last comment on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Anna's just been saying. For me, it's not so much about splitting them up, it's about putting them together, but understanding the impact that language can have when people are responding to questions in tests. It's a massive issue that's generally ignored, even though the earliest research I found in it was over 40 years ago in Israel. They did some really interesting stuff on maths and science education. And we need to be looking at that. We need to, in this context of EMI, that we need to be looking down that direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, before we close today, I'm going to hand you over to Mark in a minute, but I'd just like to say thank you to all the panelists. We've had a very, very interesting conversation, and unfortunately we could only really handle very few of the questions that were sent to us. So thank you very much for taking part and the interesting conversation we've had. So over now to Mark, and he will be talking about future events and workshops around this conference on bilingual education. So Mark, you're on mute.
My turn to be on mute. Thanks very much, Vicky, and thanks very much Luciana and Barry. You don't know how hard it was for me to actually bite my tongue and not join in all of that. But I think, having such great panelists with us, I didn't want to take up any time. So what I do want to do is just to thank everybody who's been part of this, but also to tell you about what we're going to do to follow up. And I think, what we're going to do does relate directly to some of the things that were said by all three of our panelists in this discussion now. And I'm thinking, so I'm just looking at my notes here, but I'm thinking that Anna talked about multiple perspectives, about the appropriate test. Lucy talked about trust and professionalism, and also talked about the dialogue between content teachers and language teachers. And Barry said that there was a total disconnect very often between assessment specialists and the rest of language of the learning system. And I think what we're trying to do in these workshops is follow up with our little bit of that as much as we can. So what we want to do is, at the moment, we've got other plans, but at the moment we've got 2 workshops in mind. One is looking at what we've called unwrapping the mystery behind test design and test development. And this workshop initially is going to be aimed at teachers within our bilingual education program to start, although we may well then offer it outside afterwards. And this, we're going to look at things like, how do I start to develop a test? What needs to be done? How do I ensure it's of good quality? How do I ensure it's the right test for what we're teaching? How do I make it appropriate? And Vicky and her team will lead that, and we're going to do that on the 26th of November. So that's a Thursday in about 5 weeks. And so if any of you within our bilingual education program want to be involved with that, you can get in touch with me directly, or I think we'll send a form around in the next couple of days for that. The second workshop is open to anybody. Again, initially, probably if you're based in Spain, because then we share a context. But again, we can look at opening up. If you're interested, let us know. We'll look at opening up to a wider audience. And here we're going to focus on helping students better understand authentic text, and what we can learn from reading tests. So again, what we look at there is, by looking at what the tests test, how can we make authentic text easier for learners to understand? How can we help them through authentic tests in a plurilingual, bilingual classroom? So again, the idea is not to dumb down the text, it's to support the learners in dealing with authentic text by looking at what's actually involved in reading and what we test in reading. So those are 2 workshops, and again, information will come shortly, but we'd love to have people involved in both of those, and we'll follow up from those workshops as well. And if we go to the next slide, the other thing I wanted to say is just to remember that we've got 2 more panels coming. So in 2 weeks' time, we have another panel on rethinking inclusion in plurilingual education. And in that panel, we have, again, distinguished guests. We have Tony Booth, who is one of the co-authors of the Index for Inclusion, and he'll be one of our speakers for that. And we also have, in 2 weeks after that, we're going to look at rethinking quality assurance in plurilingual education, and we're going to look at, if we're working on assessment, if we're working on better learning outcomes, if we're working on inclusion, how do we make sure these actually happen in our schools? How do we guarantee the quality of what we're doing? So those are 2 more that are coming. We hope that many of you will come back for the other 2. And it just falls me just to say thank you again. Thank you very much to everybody who's been involved. Thanks so much, Vicky and the team, Vicky for moderating, and the team, Vicky for chairing, and the team for moderating, but especially to Barry, to Lucy and to Anna for their contributions and their insight in the panel, and to all of you who are out there as well. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for your questions, very, very interesting questions, right to the point, which is what we wanted. And stay with us for more. We'll have more panels, more workshops, and hopefully more conversation. Don't forget there is a hashtag if you want to continue the conversation on Twitter, for those of you who use Twitter. And we have recorded this session, and you'll be able to access it if you want through the same link. And I hope we'll put it up on YouTube shortly as well. So bye everyone, stay safe. Thank you very much.